If we talk about South America, we will probably think of these 10 countries. We can also include the three Guianas, which are sometimes forgotten but are obviously part of the subcontinent. However, there is one possible 14th country that has many arguments for belonging to the region. We invite you to discover why Trinidad and Tobago may, or may not, be a South American country. From the Darien Gap to Cape Horn, and from the Andes Mountains to the Atlantic coast, we find South America. Some believe it is a subcontinent that belongs to the continent of America, while others consider it distinct from North America, making them two separate continents. Today, we are not going to settle that debate because we have already discussed it before. Instead, we are going to find out why Trinidad and Tobago is such a difficult place to classify. After gaining independence from the United Kingdom in 1962, Trinidad and Tobago became a sovereign nation. Before that, several European powers had ruled the islands. It had been a Spanish, British, Dutch, French, and even Corlin colony. This history created a very unique social composition. In Trinidad and Tobago, no less than 35% of the population is of Indian descent, another 34% is of African descent, and most of the rest have mixed ancestry. This can be explained by the slave trade during the colonial era, when enslaved people were brought to work on plantations. In any case, it is rather unlikely that someone would think of Trinidad and Tobago when thinking about South America. It is usually associated with the Caribbean or the West Indies. On the other hand, nobody doubts that these 10 countries make up South America. There is also no geographical doubt regarding the three Guianas, although culturally they are more closely connected to the Caribbean. But Trinidad and Tobago is a special case. The main island, Trinidad, lies extremely close to the Venezuelan coast, with only 11 kilometers separating them. So why does almost nobody consider it part of South America? Let's compare this with other islands. Nobody questions that Fernando de Noronha or the Galapagos Islands are South American, even though they are located about 360 and nearly 1,000 kilometers from the mainland, respectively. The difference is that on the other side of Fernando de Noronha, or the Galapagos, there is no other continent nearby. Oceania and Africa are much farther away, so there is little reason to associate them with anywhere else. Trinidad and Tobago, however, is also relatively close to the Caribbean, the region with which it is usually associated. Only about 130 kilometers separate Tobago from Grenada, which is unquestionably part of the West Indies. So in terms of distance, it is actually closer to the Caribbean. This is not the only place in the world where something similar happens. Think about Cyprus. It is part of the European Union, yet it is much closer to the Asian coast than to Europe. There is also Socotra, which is geographically an extension of the Horn of Africa, but belongs to Yemen and is generally associated with Asia. Another famous example is the Canary Islands. Geographically, they are clearly part of Africa, but because they belong to Spain, they are associated with Europe. But let's examine the arguments for linking Trinidad and Tobago with the Caribbean. The most obvious one is the language, since English is spoken there, just as it is on many Caribbean islands. One could point out that English is also spoken in Guyana, but that actually reinforces the argument. Although Guyana is geographically in South America, it has much stronger ties with its northern neighbors. This is due to colonization and cultural heritage, as these territories were under British rule, and many of them are still members of the Commonwealth of Nations. Trinidad and Tobago gained independence from the United Kingdom, just like several Caribbean countries. But that is not all. It was also part of the West Indies Federation, an association of states formed during the worldwide era of decolonization. It consisted of these 10 territorial units, which today correspond to different independent countries or overseas territories. The West Indies Federation was short-lived, lasting only 4 years, from 1958 to 1962. Even so, it illustrates the close relationship between the people of Trinidad and Tobago and their northern neighbors. The same can be seen in CARICOM, the key international organization of the Caribbean region. Trinidad and Tobago was one of its 4 founding members in 1973, and the founding treaty was even signed in Chaguaramas, a town located in the northwestern part of the island of Trinidad. Virtually all of Trinidad and Tobago's sporting and cultural life is more closely connected to the West Indies and the Caribbean than to Venezuela or the rest of Latin South America. But things could have turned out differently if we look at history. As we have already seen, Trinidad and Tobago was ruled by several European powers during the colonial era. At one particular point, beginning in 1777, Trinidad became part of the Captaincy General of Venezuela, which itself belonged to the Viceroyalty of New Granada. In other words, it could have shared the same fate as La Guaira, Puerto La Cruz, or Margarita Island, remaining under the authority of Caracas. However, in 1802, an agreement was signed between Spain and the United Kingdom, and Trinidad became a British dependency. You may have noticed that throughout this historical journey we referred only to Trinidad and not Tobago. That is because the two islands that make up the country have very different histories. The main island, where the capital is located, accounts for 95% of the country's population and 94% of its territory. Trinidad has many more points of connection with South America than Tobago does. We have already discussed its geographical proximity and its colonial past. But there is a third factor that is often used to define continents which may also be important: tectonic plates. From a geological perspective, Trinidad is attached to the South American plate, while Tobago is associated with the movement of the Caribbean plate. It is true that tectonic plates do not perfectly correspond to continents, but they sometimes provide interesting clues. The same can be seen in Iceland. Although it is considered part of Europe, it sits directly on the boundary between the Eurasian plate and the North American plate, giving it geological connections to both Greenland and the rest of North America. So when answering the original question, we have several possible conclusions. We can consider Trinidad and Tobago a Caribbean country rather than a South American one, since it is historically and culturally tied to that region. We can also regard it as South American, because almost the entire country lies practically attached to the Venezuelan coast. Or we can make a distinction between the two islands, associating Trinidad with South America and Tobago with the Caribbean. The tectonic plates, the wildlife, and even the history of both islands provide solid arguments for making that distinction. In our view, geography alone and simple proximity to the South American mainland are not enough to include Trinidad and Tobago as part of South America. For that reason, we believe it is more accurate to classify it as part of the Caribbean region. However, we would not necessarily say that someone who considers it South American is wrong, because there are certainly plenty of valid arguments to support that position. Could Trinidad and Tobago be the 14th country of South America? Let us know what you think in the comments. Until next time.